My earliest memories, one of them was of my grandmother, who I loved very much. Her name was Rosa Pellegrino. Once Pope John the 23rd was elected, she looked just like him. So she was a holy woman, but not very pretty. But anyway, but my earliest recollection was of my grandmother teaching me how to speak Italian. I remember her teaching me what a fork was, a fucine and stuff. I also remember we were in a dentist's office, and I thought it was a barber, and I was afraid of barbers. I don't know why. And I could see myself still running around the barber's chair or the dentist's chair and saying in Italian, "I don't want the barber, I don't want the barber, I don't want the barber." It was just a weird memory I had.
My earliest memory is a complex one. Both parents worked. During that time, Hoboken was the location of, I think, New Jersey's first parent cooperative nursery school. And it was located in Hoboken. And it was called Memorial Day Nursery School. So my parents both worked, and they needed to have me placed in group care. This is 1953 or 1954. And so what I remember is my mother bringing me to this location, which was right around the corner from where we lived, actually, and walking into the place, and this overwhelmingly strong smell of cauliflower that the kitchen was cooking. I don't think I ate cauliflower for years after that. Right? And so, and then I remember the director taking us downstairs to the backyard where there were these orange and black tricycles that kids could ride them around. And there were ants on the ground, and they were sprinkling salt on the ants. Again, that peculiar memory stayed with me. And then we came back upstairs, and as I think I'm looking around, I turn around and my mother was gone. Because the philosophy back then is, when your child is distracted, you could leave, right? No surprise I became a developmental psychologist and a child psychologist about early separation and trauma, right? So I remembered and this is the memory that stays with me. My memory is sitting on a table. They had these ceiling to floor, full-length windows. And sitting on a table in front of the window looking for my father's blue Plymouth, hoping he'd pick me up. And so that first memory that stands out, I'm sure there are other things. If I were to really dig deeply, I'd remember something else, but that stayed with me.
The first memory I have of my brother was we were in a crib. I must have been three and a half, 4, and Gerard and I would come together and kind of bang into each other, almost like a roller coaster or something, bumper cars, and we would both laugh.
Is that the head trauma I got?
Well, I would continue to beat him up until he became bigger and stronger. Then I said, no more fighting, no more fighting. That's the first thing. Oh, and another thing, I don't know if you remember this. Mommy used to call you Pumpkin Teeth. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that.
The reason why Mom called him Pumpkin Teeth was that his teeth were spaced. And I had names that she called me Pitsky.
Pitsky.
I don't know
where that came from. Pitsky, yeah.
But my mother had is the word penchant? My mother had a penchant for giving people names,
yeah, I know.
which we'll go into later.
Yeah, not always positive,
right?
Gabe was witnessing my family through some tough changes. My parents had a firstborn child, a girl, Joanne, who died at the age of 3 months, you said, right? I think 3 months. And then Gabe is the second-born, right? Even though he's the oldest child in the living family, just the two of us, he was the second child. Then a third child was born, and Gabe, I think, has memory. That child was named Gerard, and he was born in 1949, but he died in 1950. And he had been home, as opposed to Joanne, I think, had died at the hospital. I don't think she ever came home.
Mom had a picture where she's standing by
a window.
I
remember that picture.
And I think it was at 605 Jefferson Street.
No, was that?
And she said I forget if it was after Joanne died or Gerard Rocco, that the local priest, it had to be a Capuchin, gave Mom his prayer book temporarily, to loan. Yeah.
I always thought that picture was of Gerard first, Gerard Rocco, but I don't know. Could have been
No,
Joanne.
I think it was Joanne.
Joanne, okay.
I think
all right.
so. But it could have been in the hospital too. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's hard to tell. But Gerard died in 1950, And then I was born in 1951, and my mother and her mother, my grandmother Rosa, had a great devotion to Saint Gerard Majella, who's the patron saint of mothers. And so Gerard, Rocco, the first Gerard, was named after Saint Gerard. And so when I was born, even though they had just lost this Gerard, my grandmother, I think, was encouraging my mother to name me Gerard. It was a little bit of a shock for me as I got older. I would visit the cemetery, by the way, and see Gerard Rocco, Gerard Rocco, or Gerard on the tombstone, and it was a bit of an out-of-body experience. I often say, I have such a great interest in the infant-parent relationship, and I have particular interest in motherhood. All my career, I've been an infant and early childhood mental health specialist, and I often think it was kind of providential that I was named for the patron of mothers, because I've tried so hard in my life to really honor and protect and the needs for mothers in the infant-parent relationship. So I think, as I said, it's providential. But Gabe, memory-wise, probably has some memories of the first Gerard, playing with the first Gerard. But I think the memory you shared about banging, that's me.
That's right. That was you.
He wasn't old enough to do that.
Right. So my mother told me that I used to tickle my Gerard Rocco under the chin. But speaking of the name Gerard, there's a group called the League of St. Gerard, which I think was from the Redemptorist order. And they had a place in Liguori, Missouri, right?
I think that's right, Gabe.
And my mother sent in a picture of my brother and myself. And I still remember it was an oval picture. And they put out a magazine, maybe quarterly. And I remember seeing that picture. I think it was the first picture I ever saw of myself and my brother together. So anyway.
Well, and that picture, interesting. And I now this is coming back to me as we talk about this, Gabe. I have that magazine in our archives, but I actually have the photograph, right? The 8x10. And what I remember most, and now I bet you're going to remember this, is I think that picture was taken around the time of your first communion, because you had a certain, or you might have been younger.
I think that we're thinking of two different pictures, because I think in the picture I was only about maybe 5.
So all right, so we're younger, but it was taken in the studio.
Right,
it was taken in a studio
on Washington Street, right? And I remember that, and that was for my first communion. But that was another picture.
Different. Well, now I'm confused, but I thought it was the picture that was in the magazine where I became so afraid of the camera directed at you and thinking somehow that camera would hurt you, and I started crying.
Oh,
and I think that's how I wound up in the picture. Because I wasn't my recollection is I wasn't supposed to be in the picture, but I was crying so much that they convinced me that everything was safe and I could sit with my big brother. And I sat with you, and we were both dressed nicely, so we must have been prepared for picture taking.
His father died. My grandpa, Benjamin, who I never met, I was named after him. My middle name is Benjamin. And my father had 2 younger brothers, Anthony and Alphonse. So my father had to quit to take care of his family, had to quit school to take care of his family. And I think he delivered milk on a milk truck. And then he met my mother in a place called the Arrow, which was a box manufacturing place. And he also met Babe Ruth there on a freight elevator. But Hoboken in general was, maybe there were 50,000 people. Town was a square mile of 5 Catholic churches. And when we were growing up, initially in the early 50s, it was mostly Irish and Italian, maybe some German. And as my brother indicated, as the decade ended and the 60s came, there were a lot of Latinos who were coming in.
Yeah, Hoboken, in many ways, there's a renaissance for many years in Hoboken. Hoboken now is often referred to as the Gold Coast because it's directly across the river from Manhattan, and the skyline, of course, is such a beautiful view. But Hoboken itself is a very beautiful community, and over the years they went through a major gentrification, and so the old housing stock, brownstone and large brick housing, became very valuable. And the joke was in those days that you never thought you'd own $1 million home, but now you own $1 million home, except you're paying taxes on $1 million home. So many people were getting priced out on the property values going higher. And there's even a dark side to that renaissance of Hoboken, where there was a period of time in the 70s where there were a massive number of fires in many houses, often of suspicious origin, so property values can be emptied and redeveloped. Right? So Hoboken had that Dark Ages as well as the Renaissance, and it's known as the Gold Coast. And so when Gabe and I grew up, there was a saying that passed on that said, "I knew Hoboken when Hoboken was Hoboken," and so we knew Hoboken when Hoboken was Hoboken. In the days where Tootsie Roll Factory was there, Mighty Fine Pudding was at one end. Right, the South End, Standard Brands,
wasn't there
Maxwell
Wonder
House,
Bread,
Wonder Bread,
Maxwell's,
Hostess Cupcakes.
Hostess Cupcakes.
Right. I mean, all of these manufacturers were in Hoboken, and by the way, Maxwell House, to this day, their old property is known as the Maxwell, which is a high-end condo unit. So we grew up at a time where the industry in Hoboken was fairly active. And you know, the nice thing about having, there was Mighty Fine and there was Vandermeer Chocolates, which was in Lower Jersey City, but we lived in Lower Hoboken. So on rainy days, you can smell the chocolate from Vandermeer Chocolates, and on Uptown, you'd smell the coffee from Maxwell House Coffee. So Hoboken had all these great aromas growing up. But those are my memories then. And again, as Gabe said, the migration from Cuba and Puerto Rico in the late 50s really began to add new populations to our community. And I remember that vividly, where we lived in 1959, where our house, the Christmas tree, went on fire and burned our apartment.
That was an interesting story with the Christmas tree. I was 11 and my brother had just turned 8 years old. It was 1959, and so my brother and I were at a friend's house on the corner of Brusinel. Remember where Brusinel? Right. And my mother came to get us about 6 o'clock to take us back for dinner, which is a half a block away. And as we're walking to an apartment, we lived on the second floor of a two-family house. There were people outside that were looking up, and there was kind of orange lights kind of dancing off the window. And this one guy, in fact, I think his name was Mr. Azzolini, might have been Nicky Azzolini's father, said, "Is that a fire in your house?" And my mother said, "No." So we went in, and my mother's holding my hand, and Gerard was in back of us. We're going up, and we open up the door, and the tree is on fire,
flaming.
And we had a dog, and the dog got as far as away from the tree, from the fire as he could, and I broke away from my mother, and I ran in to get the dog. It was pure instinct. It was just pure instinct. And I got the dog, and I said, "Trigger," and the dog jumped into my arms, and we were running out. So Gerard led, then my mother, and then me, and I could feel, as we were going out, the heat of the Christmas tree. And unfortunately, I think it would have happened anyway, but my parents split up after that. And we never found out what caused the fire. Was it a short? I don't think it was arson or anything like that.
For many years, sometimes memories are reconstructive. They're not reproductive. It's not like you press a replay and it plays back accurately. So my reconstruction of that day was that the landlord, who lived on the first floor and we were on the second floor tenants, the landlord's son, Mr. Washington. Right. My recollection was that his son, and I don't know, this doesn't reconcile, was trying to put the fire out with a carpet or a rug. And I remembered seeing that image, then my brother grabbing the dog, my mother taking us all downstairs and running out to save ourselves. we didn't know for a while where my father
was. Yeah.
Right? We thought, could he be in the house?
Right.
Could it have been trapped? And so for a little while, we all worried. We went
Yeah.
to our friend Rosanelle's house,
Right. Yeah,
looked from her window at the firefighters fighting the fire,
Yeah.
seeing this all. And then we discovered, I don't quite remember how it happened, that my father was in the corner bar. And the good news is there was a local bar in Hoboken. So many corner bars
That's
existed,
right, yeah.
and he had his own fire safety rules. Go to a bar in case it's fire. If there's a fire, go in the bar when it's not a fire too. But at least it worked that day.
Yeah.
So that memory is seared in our memories. And I remember going back up to the apartment with my mother, surveying the damage, and we had a yellow parakeet. That died. And I remembered, and again, as an 8-year-old, that's kind of trauma. I remembered the cage and the carcass of this charred bird, dead, and so looking at all the things. And yet my mother had this idea you can save things. Believe it or not, the furniture that our bedroom set that we had for Gabe and I, Lewis's refinishing, I think it was.
I think
she
so,
actually
right.
had this company that refinished it rather than buying new stuff.
And the TV too.
And the TV, I think, the TV was that right? Yeah, did it? Yeah.
It was the old TV,
The old
not the
TV,
new. Right,
not
we
the
had
new
two
one. Okay.
TVs, right?
So that was a searing memory for us because we lost everything. We lost everything, and that precipitated the separation of my parents because we all temporarily had to live with his mother. Above a candy store owned by our family, 8 blocks away, and we lived there for a couple of weeks, I think.
Right, with Uncle Tony and
Aunt Mary,
Right,
and then by that time my mother found a cold water flat. That term, by the way, cold water flat, is referred to apartments that have no built-in heating, but have a gas burner in one room that you can light with a match that has gas, and it heats the whole apartment, except it heats that main room well, and you sort of have to find a way to bring the heat down the railroad rooms, the rooms that are lined up, and my mother found that apartment for us.
Just a few things about my father, our father. My memories as a very, very young kid, might have been even before Gerard was born. I think I've told you this, and it sounds surprising, but I remember thinking, I was sitting like in a little rocking chair, and I remember thinking, I'm so lucky to have this mother and this father. And it was like ideal. I don't remember my father drinking, even when we lived in 540 Marshall Drive. But once he started drinking, things got bad. He had a lot of good things. He was the most unprejudiced person that you'd ever want to meet. He was kind in many ways.
Absolutely.
But he was a violent alcoholic. I don't believe I was ever sexually abused, but we were physically abused. I mean, I'd go to school with 5 fingerprints on my face or a fat lip, and the teacher thought, well, he got into a school fight. What's that group if the teacher feels that something's going on?
In those days, it used to be called DIFUS.
It's
now called DCP&D.
Right, right. But a few other things. I remember one time I was in the 2nd grade, and now I'm a mathematician, but the teacher gave us like 64 math problems. And I just went home. I just started crying. I said, Dad, I can't do this. He says, we will do these in 10 minutes. And we did. For a person with only a 9th grade education, he was great. Another time, I remember he worked on the sea trains, which were like, he was a longshoreman, but instead of being at the docks, he were up the trains. It was a Saturday morning. I think Gerard was too young. And he took me to Edgewater, where he worked. And he took me in a locomotive. I still remember the engineer's name was George Temple. I still remember that. And the other thing too was the Babe Ruth story. I was 10 years old. It was either 1958 or 1959, but it was March, and my father's looking at the TV guide on a Sunday afternoon. He says, Gabe, the Babe Ruth story's on tonight, but it's on at 12:30, and you got school tomorrow. And my father had to work the next day too. He says, why don't you go to bed early? Mom will wake you up and we'll see the Babe Ruth story together. I never forgot that, and it changed my life. I went from Davy Crockett to Babe Ruth. That was
and Al Jolson in between there
yeah,
too.
who's little
Gabe
Al
is an Al
Jolson.
Jolson fan.
And then I noticed Marilyn Monroe.
Well, there you go. That's right. My dad took Gabe and me to Yankee Stadium. One of the earliest times I remember being there. It might have been my first time.
Right.
And it might have been the second time. But the first time I remember, two memories stand out, and I may be merging them, the both visits. The one was that my dad knew a way to get there on Jerome Avenue that was faster. He somehow got there quickly, and I remember on Jerome Avenue, he just took it and got there fast. And I think he challenged Gabe that he couldn't walk around the stadium in 15 minutes
or whatever,
10 minutes like that. And Gabe was a fast walker. He was a skinny blink guy.
Skinny Blink.
Skinny Blink. That was the other name we used to use. Skinny Blink. We've heard that, right? Skinny Blink was another one. And so Gabe did 12 minutes. My father timed it. He walked around the whole stand. I think it was 12 minutes. That was Manny's baseball land was there and all those places. But the second memory I have, and it might be another visit or the same visit, is Maris and Mantle were going for their home run race. And Maris was a good player and a decent man, but the fans were so mixed about Maris, this interloper who was now going to set Mickey Mantle, who was the heir apparent to Joey D, right, and the Babe. And so there was a guy in the stadium with a handkerchief, shaking his handkerchief, yelling, saying, "Yoo-hoo, Maris, you're a bum! You're a bum, Maris!" Right? And I'm looking at this guy, and I'm thinking, "Oh my God!" And so that memory stands out. And relatedly, when we walked in from the ramps to the stadium, I have never seen the field that green. We only had black and white TV. Do you remember that? You talked about this too, Gabe.
Right.
We walked in, it was like the Wizard of Oz. Suddenly it's color. And it was, powerful.
Bro, I think that you're just conflating things. Because the first time we went was with the rec.
Oh, that's right.
With the
Recreation Center.
We went to Yankee Stadium, and Gerard and I saw Ted Williams hit a home run. Remember
that? I don't remember.
Right.
Yeah,
but that green.
That was probably the first time we were there.
You talk about a panorama. It was like heaven. It was it.
And that's what I think helped seal the deal to be a Yankee fan that day.
Hey, take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I never get back. Let me root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame.
I've always liked mathematics, and about 40 years ago, I guess, I had gone out for dinner with two priests, Father Lennon and Father De Rosa. And we went to an Italian restaurant, and I thought I ordered decaf coffee at the end of the meal. Well, it turned out I didn't. It was caffeine. I couldn't sleep, so I got home, and this is like in the early 80s, and there was no internet or whatever, and so I took out the baseball encyclopedia, and I started looking at Babe Ruth's home run totals, and I realized after just putting things together back and forth that Babe Ruth actually out-homered teams, and he did it 90 times. He out-homered teams 90 times in his career. And I said, wow, did anyone else do this? And I couldn't find anyone close to him. So I started putting things together, and at this time, my oldest friend, Frank Matola, gave me books called Baseball Abstract that was self-published by this guy, Bill James, who is the high priest of sabermetrics. And he defined the term sabermetrics as a search for objective knowledge about baseball, taking the saber from an organization called the Society for American Baseball Research. So I went to the people at Seton Hall. I said I'd like to do a course, and one thing led to another. I believe it was the first course ever offered on sabermetrics for college credit, and then we introduced it at West Point. Now, a lot of schools have it. Look, I was just fortunate. I stumbled across it before anyone else did. But I must add that there's a fundamental theorem of sabermetrics, and I'm going to make a connection. You know, at West Point, I mean, I've been so fortunate, and I've been there. I was only supposed to be there a year, and now it's like 30 years I've been there. But this one Tuesday, Colonel Borman, Frank Borman, who was a West Point graduate, was the first man to apparently sail around the moon. He didn't go on the moon.
That's right. He was an astronaut, Frank Borman.
So I knew he was coming in the department, and I'm walking down the halls, long hallway, and he's being escorted by Captain Slocum. And so I knew Borman was going to be there. I said, "Sir, it's a pleasure to meet you." He said, "Father, what do you do?" I said, "I teach, yada, yada, yada." And I had Captain Slocum as a student. He said, "Yeah, what'd you have him for, calculus?" I said, "No, I had him for sabermetrics." He said, "Sabermetrics, what's that?" I says, "Well, it's a baseball course. In fact, I'm going to ask Captain Borman to tell you the fundamental theorem of sabermetrics." He said, "What is it?" So Borman starts. He says, "If you do an analysis and Babe Ruth's not the best ever," then Borman just says, "Well, there's something wrong with the analysis." I felt like kissing him.
That's right.
And I was beaming. They were moonbeams.
That's
I had
right.
moonbeams
That's right.
because of this. And so that's the fundamental theorem. And I didn't make that up. People
like
have
that.
said that.
I like
the
that.
fundamental theorem of sabermetrics.
Something's wrong with the statistics.
Something's wrong with it. Anyway. How was it growing up in a house with an icon?
My father was Yogi Berra. My father only wanted three things in life: a home, a family, and belonging to a golf course. He figured the way he was going to get that was by playing baseball. He loved baseball. His family came first. He was not materialistic at all.
I'm sure that the Catholic Church was very important to your mom and dad.
I don't think I saw my father miss 3 masses.
Wow.
His generosity, the way he helped people, he talked to them and never turned anybody down. He never understood about the feelings people had for him.
Oh, who doesn't like Yogi Berra? Who
Right.
doesn't love Yogi Berra?
He was proud to serve his country. He knew that's what he had to do. He was at Normandy. That pushed him over the limit.
There was a gentleness about him. I know he's a strong man. Nothing so strong as real gentleness, and nothing so gentle as real strength. That was your dad. I remember watching Yogi Berra. I was 10 years old. And would I think that I was ever going to meet him and interview his son? This is like a dream. This is like a dream. That's what baseball does. My father and I had a more difficult relationship than my brother, I think, and he was certainly harmed by it, but I was too, and we were harmed in different ways, but I think he tried to make it up to us in his own way after he and my mother split. We would go into bars, and then I'll ask my brother to tell something about bars. So we'd go into bars, and my father knew I loved Babe Ruth, so he would start a conversation with the bartender. He had this affinity for bartenders.
He was an extraordinarily engaging guy, my dad. Yeah.
So anyway, he said, "My son here thinks that Babe Ruth was better than Maris and Mantle," and the bartender would always agree with him. "No, Maris and Mantle are better." I'm saying, "What are you kidding?" Just go on. But it was my father's way, I think, to do this. Yeah. But speaking of bars, I give you the master.
Yeah. So after the fire that happened, our parents separated. We moved for a couple of weeks to his mother's house on 7th and Adam Street. And then we found this cold water flat that we all lived, Gabe and I and my mother, single parent, which we really honor that. But right on the corner of that house was Clarkie's Tavern. It was a very well-known local jaunt, and everyone went there. And we knew Clarkie. Clarkie was a really decent guy, and we knew all the guys, my dad's friends there. And we would walk in, and we were Phil's kids, Phil's son. I don't know how in God's name I developed this wonderful ability, but at this very young age, and I must have been only about 9 or so, I could say the alphabet backwards. I could recite the A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I can go backwards. I can't do it now. So my dad would have a couple of drinks and say, "Hey, Gerard, show him how you can say the alphabet backwards." So I would like a parrot. I would do the alphabet backwards, and of course my father would beam, and of course people were impressed that I had this savant skill of sorts. And again, he had, in his own way, pride in us. You know, he did. The difficulty with my dad when he drank, and Gabe alluded to it, is he could be violent, sometimes more towards Gabe than me, but he can certainly be hurtful to us. But he was very abusive to my mother, and so my mother had been hospitalized for oral surgery because he had punched her and kicked her. And he had, the police would come to my house so many times because my father would tear up her dresses with a knife, and I remember vividly the police coming and my mother having newspaper in which she had wrapped around a knife and the dress that was torn up. I got to know the telephone repair guy because he would pull the phone out of the wall all the time in one of his drunken stupors. And in one of his drunken stupors, he did something to the TV, and you're going to tell this story, right? The TV repairman came. One time he took all the food out of our refrigerator and put it in
that's a great
bags
story.
And gave it to the lady across the street, right? And of course, when my father left, my mother went there, and the lady so kindly, Mrs. Banky, Siegfried Banky's mother, Siegfried was a friend of ours, Mrs. Banky said, "Listen, don't worry, I'm married to a nut too." And she gave diffused it beautifully. She gave us all the food back. Yeah. But the television repairman, Paul and Son, was the TV repairman in Hoboken.
Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but when the TV went on the blink, they used to say, I always thought it was my fault. So when the guy came, I used to hide in the bathroom. I don't know if you remember that. But anyway, things changed, and the light shone on my brother. So the TV repairman comes, and my brother says, "I wish you were my father." Oh, bing!
Imagine what leads a young child to say that. I mean, by the way, the pain is there, but also the humor at that. But the pain was there. I mean, what would make a kid say that, right? Yeah. Well, the joke in my family, too, was either the television is on the bum or the bum is on the television, if you remember my father. Because my grandmother would call. My grandmother was, my mother's mother was a remarkable woman. And at some point when it was so clear that my mother and father were just painfully in this not so good marriage. So at one point, I think my parents had separated several times. And my father would always live with his mother. And this is before the house burned down. And, Gabe and I often would want my mother to allow my dad back. And again, we didn't know.
More you than me.
Probably me.
That's right.
And we didn't always know the dad we would get back in the house. We just didn't know. Right? He was a very unpredictable person. Yeah. But one time, my mother was out of the house, and my grandmother and I were alone in the apartment. And my father came into the house, and he wasn't supposed to be there. There was no restraining order. There was nothing so formal in 1959. There really wasn't. Interestingly, our parish priest, he typed up a letter, and my father signed it, that said, "I will not drink. I will not abuse the children," or Lena, his wife, and he signed it. And I have that. I have that in our archives somewhere along the way. My mother saved that. So he tried in so many ways to sort of help himself. But on this particular day, he was visiting. He wanted to come, I guess, and see me and Gabe. I don't even know if Gabe was home. He wasn't.
No.
And my grandmother, this feisty old Italian lady, right, shut the door of the apartment, got this big double seating couch that we had, similar to that size, pushed it in front of the door, and sat on it with me next to her. And my father's banging on the door, trying to get in. And my grandmother, with a serenity that I cannot understand, had this look of serenity like, don't worry. And my father left, right? And so what often would happen is my grandmother would visit the house before they separated, and my father would sometimes be home before he went to work. And one of the standard stories was that my grandmother would ring the bell, open the door downstairs, and she would say, "O bum está gas, is the bum home?" Right? And so obviously my father didn't have love for her either, right? So, but she protected us. So, again, I have to say, these are very, I say this on my behalf, I think for Gabe too, these are very mixed memories that we're sharing. They're disclosures in some sense that are a painful part of our growing up, that I think we felt scarred from, but found ways through it. I think we're really pretty good healed about it, but we remember them vividly. But I regard this opportunity to talk about our lives as a record for my children and those who knew us, as just, almost a testament to, look, relationships help you through everything. You get through it. You get through. But those memories stand out, and Grandma was a significant person in that memory profile.
So how did I become a priest? Well, I tell you that there were three people who were significant as far as being priests. One was Father Frank Mayone, who was my parish priest as a kid, and he will always be the number one. Then I met a Franciscan priest by the name of Father Sal Panagia, and a third priest, Monsignor Dick Liddy in the seminary. But going back before that, my grandmother was such an important figure in my life. She was a Third Order Franciscan, a lay Franciscan, and she was actually buried in the habit of St. Francis. But the whole St. Francis thing comes down to my brother and my father's death. So all of these things come together. So my brother was the Holy One. I mean, he went to Catholic school, I didn't. He was an altar boy, I wasn't. And he went to the seminary for 6 years, 4 years high school, 2 years of college. Yeah, that's true. I had to have some fun first. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. So at this point in my life, I fell in love for the first time. I was a freshman at Stevens Tech. The Vietnam War was going on, and I'm having all sorts of questions about God. I always believed in God, but I didn't quite know what was happening. The very day my father died, which was March the 13th, 1967, it was a Monday. And my brother was in the seminary. What grade you were in?
I was sophomore.
He was sophomore. So I go home after class, and my mother's crying. Now, the night before, I had visited my father, who was at his mother's house, my other grandmother, and he wasn't feeling well. So I left him, and at this point, I wasn't physically afraid of him, although I knew I could run faster than him if I had to. So I go home, and my mother's crying. I said, "Ma, what happened?" She said, "Daddy died." And I made a statement. I said, "Mom, Daddy died a long time ago." So my brother comes home. And here I am. Now, he is the expert on religion. He still is. But anyway, I said to him, I'm asking him questions stuff. And he said a line, I don't know if the word would be innocuous or innocent, but he said, even atheists venerate St. Francis of Assisi. Atheists. And I was looking for something. We had one book in an engineering school.
That's right.
On St. Francis. It was by Chesterton. And that book changed my life. I read the book, and I went to my parish priest, Father Mayone, who's Father Francis Mayone. So there was a nice connection there. And that started me thinking of the priesthood. Now, I was 18. Now, I almost got engaged, and I was on the dating game.
I was going to say, don't forget that piece.
Game
Gabe was on the dating game.
In 1975. I did this as a lark, and there's a couple of nice stories with this. So how did I get on? It's in California. Well, they were spending 3 weeks here in New Jersey.
That's right.
And I went on the practice game, and I knocked it dead, bing, bing, bing. When it started, I was like Jackie Gleason, humming. Now,
I was in the studio audience looking at him.
Right.
Yeah.
So the girl's name was... not Becky. Anyway, I can't remember. But you can't see her, of course, because there's the wall.
There's a screen,
so I
yeah.
go up there and I kiss her. And then my mother says, "It's only Italian mother. You wouldn't have liked her. She was top heavy." I said, "Ma, top heavy is good.
That's exactly
I
what we're
gotta hide
looking
this.
for.
Top heavy is good." But anyway, that's exactly. So anyway, so she alternated with that, and you're gonna see one of your tomatoes. But
That's
a
right.
whole
That's
nother
right.
thing.
Well, you never know, right? You
But
never know which
then,
way it'll go.
Then in God's good time, he had called me. It was time for me to set me apart. So when I was 25, I went to the seminary. But because of my love of St. Francis, I equated being a priest with being a Franciscan. It turned out at that time it just wasn't a good match or mix, because they were emphasizing that you're first and foremost a Franciscan, a friar, a community member. And I said, well, yeah, I want to do that, but I want to be a priest. And if you're asking me what's more important, I got to be a priest. And so I went to seminary. I was glad I spent the 2 years there.
Yeah, no
It was a
question.
great base of spirituality. And then after 3 years in the seminary, I was ordained a deacon. I had a great year in Queen of Peace in North Arlington, great priest there. And then I was a parish priest for a year, but because I had a master's at that, actually I had two masters, one in theology, a master's in math, the Archbishop sent me back for my doctorate and go to Seton Hall. And I've only had 2 priest assignments.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That 1 year,
Yeah.
and that's it. But it was all because of him and St. Francis.
Well, the seminary that I went to were a branch of the Franciscans called the Capuchin Franciscans, and there was a parish in Hoboken, St. Anne's Church in Hoboken, which was a Capuchin parish, and there were 2 other Franciscan parishes in Hoboken at the time, another branch of the Franciscans called the Conventuals. But so, interestingly, the St. Anne's Church is the same baptismal font and church where my father was baptized
Right.
in, that Gabe and I were baptized there. My both children were baptized there. Kelly and I got married in that church, and I have had a long connection with that church because of the Capuchin Franciscan tradition. So even though Gabe spent a couple of years with the Capuchins, he carries within him that Franciscan charism. So he carries it with him all the time. And even though I was in 6 years, 4 years high school, 2 years college, I look back, and I'm 74, and that's high school. It has influenced my formation in ways that I can't even begin to describe. I think how my ideas of fraternity and community are so strong. My ideas of social justice, service to the poor and service to those have less. So a Franciscan charism. And I think that even though Gabe left the Franciscans formally to pursue the priesthood, he remains, I think, a model Franciscan. In fact, this is not disclosing anything private. The cardinal of our archdiocese regards Gabe, a priest of the diocese, as an ordered priest almost as the kind of priest that's more of an ordered priest, a Franciscan. Gabe and I had this conversation yesterday when we went to the probability seminar yesterday. We talk in the car, and we have these conversations every couple of months. We drive down together and talk for 3 hours about things. We're talking about how pivotal the Catholic Church and the Franciscan tradition has been in our lives. I can't tell you how pivotal.
And our grandmother was a third order
Third order
Franciscan.
Franciscan, that's right.
A couple of things about St. Francis that maybe a lot of people don't know. A lot of people think of the birds and the nature and stuff, and he was all of that, but he was much more than that. Vladimir Lenin, on his deathbed, I guess you could consider him one of the fathers of communism.
Sure.
Right? He apparently said if he had 10 men like Francis of Assisi, he would have had the world. Now, I want to tell you another story about an Irish Franciscan priest who I love like a grandfather, Father Mike Quinlan. So Father Quinlan, as almost every Irish person I know, has that gift of wisdom, and nothing could upset him. So he called me Gaby. And I must have been ordained 3 or 4 years, and he was a retired priest at Seton Hall. He ultimately went back to, I guess it was Tralee in Ireland. Anyway, so I'm sitting with him and we're having a drink. He says, "Gaby, I noticed there's something bothering you. What is it?" Well, so when I was ordained a deacon, and that was the more important thing, because you become a member of the clergy, you take all of your obligations. The priesthood is like the cream, but the cherry on the cream or whatever. Yeah. So it wasn't a matter of making the commitment, and I enjoyed my deacon year, but as priesthood approached, I noticed I was getting very anxious, and I had never suffered an anxiety attack in my life. And Lord knows with that I should have. I finally realized, like after a year or so, one of the things that's really bothering me is I don't understand how God would call me to be a priest and not St. Francis, because St. Francis wasn't a priest. And that was weighing on my mind. I'm sure part of that was the devil. So I told Mike this, almost like a confessional thing. I said, "Mike, here's this. You're a Franciscan. Why was St. Francis not a priest?
Not a priest,
and I was.
Right. Yeah.
Why? I mean, he's the greatest guy, maybe after Babe Ruth, who ever walked on the earth."
After the Babe?
That's right. Anyway. And why did God call me? And then he said, with the wisdom that only the Irish have, he says, "Gaby, if it was God's choice to make you a priest and not St. Francis, it was his choice, and he didn't have to consult with you. Now get me another scotch." And that's a true story. And it was almost a sacramental moment.
That's
like
really beautiful.
Lifting,
it is, yeah. Lifted that burden, right?
He was a great man. Great man. It's been quite a trip. Couldn't have done it without my mother, my grandmother, and my brother, and the 3 priests. Oh, and there's one other guy, Mr. Rodriquez. Mr. Rodriquez, he was my math teacher. I loved him like a father. And between Mr. Rod, Father Mayoni, and put St. Francis there, they took the place of my father. But Mr. Rodriquez was a Spaniard, and he was really funny. He knew no political correctness at all. He would have been arrested 17 times over, because he not only was a brilliant mathematician, he was at least as good of a teacher, if not more, and he also taught physics. But he had the gift for instilling confidence.
Oh, yeah.
Here I was, no confidence. I mean, I figured I had been beaten down, literally and figuratively, and here he comes, and he took me under his wing, and he said to me, "Why don't you become a teacher? You're good in math." And I said, "Mr. Rod, I can." And he helped me get a scholarship to Stevens, because we could have never afforded it. And so I kept in touch with him. In fact, I had established an award in his honor in Hoboken High School. But once COVID came, that kind of washed that away. But he was funny. But some of the things he would say, like a student might say, "Mr. Rod, what's my average? Costa, your average is so low. If you got 100 from now on, it'll be up to 0. That's how low you are." And Ralphie Terminello says, "Mr. Rod, what page are you on?" In your case, any page, Terminello. And
he was hilarious, yeah. And we got to know him, yeah.
Leo Smith, who's a good friend of ours, was a football player. He didn't have Mr. Rod as a student. He would cut study hall to just sit in Mr. Rod's class.
There was this wonderful relationship between Stevens Institute of Technology and Hoboken High School. And so, and I still think this continues to this day, that several successful students at the high school are eligible to get a scholarship to go to Stevens for the 4-year scholarship. And I think that's still the case. So Gabe was one of those privileged students, but also well-deserving because of his mathematical knowledge. One of the things Gabe has always done, and this is a great example of it, and I think I've tried to do this in my life, and I'm sure I've seen him do it. I emulated that, is Gabe has a great devotion to his teachers. He really honors his teachers. I have done that in my career, I hope. There are certain supervisors and mentors I've had in my career who almost every presentation I give, I have a slide that says thanks to these people, because I'm part of a tradition that didn't begin with me, you know, and so Gabe is that way. Mr. Rod became a family friend. So this Gabe is Gabe's teacher, but we all got to know Mr. Rod, my mother and me, and we loved him. We cared for him deeply, and so in that regard, Gabe and I both have had the privilege of finding these adults in our lives along the way. You know, my dad fell short of the mark. He did, you know. He had a lot of great qualities that I think we both appreciated and could learn from. But he had a couple of tough qualities that hurt us and hurt my mother. But we found people in our relationships, in our lives. And Mr. Rod, like you said, is one of them, Father Mayoni. But I think it's almost a story I'd want anyone to know who knows me and Gabe, that we were just fortunate in our lives to find these great people who took us under their wing, you know, and just helped us.
I'm glad Dad had the opportunity to go to confession towards the end of his life.
Oh,
yeah.
I want to tell you a story about that. Gabe is the priest, obviously. But before he became a priest, he really had a deep spirituality, much deeper than mine. And this is not to say he's better than me or I'm better than him, but it's accurate. There's a practice in the Catholic Church that I think is done in honor of a very well-known saint, Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque. And it's a tradition of going to Mass on the 9 first Fridays of 9 months consecutively. And it sounds like hocus pocus, like it's magic. You do this and you get to heaven free. It's not that simple. But that she made this promise that if you make these 9 First Friday devotions, you won't leave this world until God has had a chance to help you with the passage. And my father had stopped going to church. He was still an alcoholic when he died. He died at the age of 43 from cirrhosis of the liver. We sort of talk about how he never drank hard liquor, always beer. He had coasters on his bedside. Gabe took him for 9 First Fridays before he died.
He did make the 9 First Fridays.
And Gabe did it. And so I always think it's one of the things to not think that his vocation just happened, you know, when he decided to join the Capuchins. He had a spirituality which I think is really great. I mean, and you know, you can thank our grandmother and other people, but thanking him too.
One of Chesterton's lines was, where religion would have driven men to madness, theology kept them sane. And the religion, you can be a religious fanatic, and we all know examples of that. But theology tries to explain it. And I look at my father, in fact, I think I told you this, I didn't learn until after I was a priest that a dog Gerard and I had was thrown out the window by my father in a drunken stupor on a Saturday night. The guy next door was a contractor, Roger Albanese, and he had, you know, all different colors paint. So I wake up on Sunday morning. I must have been, we were still at 309 2nd Street, so I had to be about 10 years old.
That's right.
His mom was Trigger, and Trigger ran away. So my mother lied to us, which she had to. I understand now. So it was a Sunday, so I couldn't find a dog. So I called Frank Matola, who was my best friend, and we went to Mass. Frank, you got to pray for the dog. But the reason why I brought up Roger Albanese was that there was some red spots down on the ground. And my mother said, it's probably paint from this. Anyway, fast forward, I didn't learn until after I was ordained a priest.
Oh, many years
that
later.
My father threw the dog away. And all I kept thinking about, here's my mother sending me out, knowing I can't find the dog. But,
easy
you
to
know,
be
I
angry.
realized
Right.
what was going on. Try to put this in the context of theology. The fathers of the Council of Trent in the 1500s said, we still suffer from the effects of original sin. some might say, well, that's just a rationalization. I don't think so. I do believe that there are things, and I defer to the psychologists for this, that I'm not sure. Let me ask you a professional opinion. If there is evil, there are things, can we ever get to the bottom essence of it? What do you think?
I think there are many people in the field of psychology and behavioral science who probably wouldn't use the term evil because they regard that as more the domain of metaphysics and spirituality. I don't. I regard evil as a reality that exists in our world. Right. And so I do think, and we had this conversation, my brother and I had this conversation yesterday about grace builds on nature.
Right.
But I think evil builds on nature too. Meaning that if people's lives have been characterized by abuse, neglect, fragility, vulnerability, they're more likely to engage in behaviors that we would regard as evil. And so, I think it's similar to that.
There's all sorts of things, like I referred to Mr. Rodriquez, so I love like a father. We call St. Francis our seraphic father.
That's right.
Is that a shot at my father? Deep down, I hope it's not. But I also know that feelings are morally neutral, and that you feel what
not
you
good
feel.
or bad, that's right.
And in the final analysis, as far as I'm concerned, I can't go all the way down that rabbit hole when there's so many other rabbit holes that are more important. And I only have a finite number of times, so I put it in God's hands. I pray for my father. I offer masses for my father. If you ask me, am I still angry? Well, I told Gerard this. Do you remember, like 2 years ago, I told you that I actually had a dream that I had a fight with that, or at least I put.
Oh yeah.
No, it wasn't that. I said he was looking at me, and I said, "Are you going to hit me?"
Oh, that's what it was.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't know why I had that dream, but I put it in God's hands. And,
yeah.
And it could be that I believe, obviously, as a Catholic, in the communion of saints and the connection between all the living and all the dead, and I took that in a sense as he needs prayers, because God's experience of time in heaven, I believe, is so different than ours. So, I put things in God's hands, and I continue my journey. When I was ordained a priest, I took Hebrews 5:2 as my almost every priest.
Love that.
When he's ordained, will put out a
memorial like a mass card. Yeah.
And so I picked Hebrews 5:2. Hebrews 5:2 says, "He's able to deal patiently with errant sinners, for he himself is beset by weakness."
Yeah, I love that.
I wouldn't have picked me for a priest, but God did. And I love it. Yeah, with the exception of celibacy. And working on that to change that rule.
On that, right?
But anyway, but it's been quite a journey. And just one other thing, Archbishop Sheen, I don't know if you remember, he was a great priest. He was asked once if he could do things over again, would he become a priest? And he said, "Oh no." "What do you mean, Archbishop? You always spoke highly of the priesthood." "Oh, priesthood is great, but I don't want to go through life again." He says, "Once is enough."
Once is enough, yeah.
And I think what Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they rest in God. I believe, with the exception of Scripture, I believe no words were ever more inspired than those words by Augustine. Because it's true. I've never met anybody who's been totally happy. There's always something that you want.
There's a wonderful notion I came across in the field of psychology, which I have really so appreciated, and it really was developed by a researcher at Stanford University who oversaw a project called the Forgiveness Project. And he looked at not the moral or ethical characteristics of forgiveness, but the medical health benefits of forgiveness. What happens to those people who forgive in terms of their health, right? But he developed a notion that I have found to be one of the most helpful notions in my work, called a grievance story. That we all develop grievance stories in our lives, Oh, your mother didn't give you what you needed to, your father hurt you, your brother stole your girlfriend, your best friend cheated on you. And sometimes the sins are real. They're real bad things that have happened. Sometimes they grow out of your own dissatisfaction with a relationship and you interpret something as painful. But those grievance stories often are immutable. They stay for years. You haven't talked to your brother in 30 years. How come? It's 30 years ago. Have you tried? No. Why not? Well, we just haven't talked to each other. It stays immutable, right? I think going through this conversation reminds us that there were many grievance stories I think I have in my life. Some of them have to do with the failures of my father, right? That he wasn't there for us in a way. I certainly think the grievance story contributed to me trying to be a very different kind of father than he was to my kids. And sometimes you can do that willfully. Sometimes you can be intentional. Most of the times you enact it without even wanting to. You know, my wife Kelly has a pillow on our bed that her friend Felicia gave her that says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, I am my mother after all." Sometimes you become that person. You reenact and introject parts of them, right? Bruce Springsteen had this wonderful interview with Terry Gross a number of years ago, which I loved, and Terry Gross is a great interviewer for NPR. And he said, she asked about his songwriting, and he talked about what he called the flotsam and the jetsam of life, right? The stuff I pull on and the stuff I throw off. Those are nautical terms. And that's what I am so struck by whenever you and I have these conversations. The stuff we hold on and the stuff we cast off, you know, the flotsam and the jetsam. I mean, I think if everybody had a chance to tell your story to yourself and to someone who's listening. One of the things I've asked my son to do, when he went to college, I wrote him 45, it's called Lessons from Dad. I typed out this 45 lessons I hoped he learned from me. And I said many of them you might have seen me do, but most of them I felt short. But one of them was, every day in your life, spend some time thinking about your own narrative. Where did you come from? What's your story? Because it's always there with you. And sometimes your story is what leads you to behave badly to other people, or it makes you expect something you shouldn't expect, or it makes you feel offended by something. So that grievance story concept, I have to say, it's helped me so much in thinking about trying to not hold on to those grievance stories as much as we can. Gabe and I have been really good with each other too, because we talk a lot, he and I, and we help each other a lot with our grievance stories, you know.
The greatest homilist I ever heard is still alive. He's like 103, 104 years old. Monsignor Jim Turo. He was a professor and a wonderful man, a scholar, a scripture scholar. His homilies lasted like 35, 45, maybe 1 seconds or 1 minute. Tremendous. He always evoked a response. So when he was coming out for Mass, you knew you better listen. Because if you don't listen, you ain't going to get it.
You're missing it.
And so I like to think I'm a popular homilist, not because I'm good, but because I'm short. And the people like that, because they know that you're not going to go on and on. But the reason why I said that, Turo is also an author, as I might have alluded to. In one of his books, he wrote, "In the sacraments, God and his people come fiercely together." That word fiercely. And I'm reminded of the beauty of the sacraments. In fact, if you ask me, what's my favorite sacrament? What's the favorite thing I do? It's not saying Mass, it's second. Even more than that, I enjoy confessions. And I'll tell you what, I was a newly ordained priest. I'm not sure I told you this story. And one of my classmates from, I don't know, it was Patterson or Trenton, called me. We were ordained maybe 3 weeks. And he said, "Gabe, listen, I got to tell you something." And he was kind of asking my advice on this. And, you know, I realized afterwards, and he did, that he was absolutely right in what he did. So he had a wake service, and it was his first wake service in that parish. So the director, the funeral director, welcomed him. And he said, "Hi, Father, welcome. Come on in. I hear you're new in the parish. What can I do for you?" He says, "Well, after the wake service, I'd like to offer confession. So can I do that?" He says, "I have no one else here, so I'll put you in the next room and I'll set up chairs for you. No problem at all." So he finishes his prayer service, the rosary, or whatever it was. And he had one confession. So this beautiful woman, maybe 25, 30 years old, comes in, very nicely dressed, and she started to shake. And the priest said, "Gabe, I knew instinctively it was an abortion. I knew it." So he said to the woman, "How can I help you?" He said, "Father, I did something that I can't tell you." He says, "Why don't you sit down?" And he held her hand. He says, "Listen, no matter what you tell me, God will forgive you. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you absolution anyway. So even if you don't tell me. And that was the question he had of me afterwards. It turns out he was right to do that. But he said, but if you tell me what you did, I promise you'll feel better. And then she just opened up and said, Father, I'm not worried about myself. I'm worried about that life it was on. And okay, he said, look, everything's in God's hands. Put in God's hands. He gave her absolution. So he called me. He said, Gabe, I don't know if I did the right thing by saying, I said, look, I'll check with a sacramental theologian, a canon lawyer. My gut feeling is you did. Because if people are not emotionally able to do something, then it's not expected that they do. And he was absolutely right in what he did. But the reason why I bring that up is because of the beauty of the sacraments. And so there's a healing, in my own life when I think of what my father did and the relationship and the harm, I try to put that in the context that me as a man, as a Catholic, as a priest, as a minister of the sacrament of confession, I have to follow my own preaching. And it's been a struggle. I hope I see my Father in heaven, and I hope there's no fear in heaven. I can't believe that there is in heaven, but I believe that there is heaven with no fear and only love. It's been a struggle, and that's why I've always felt, even in person of St. Francis, from what I read about St. Francis, he was not a man of peace in a lot of ways. He struggled with a lot of things. He would throw himself into thorn bushes. He would put ashes on his food. He would use a log as a pillow just for personal asceticism. But he always preached joy. And he told his followers, if you're not joyful, don't come to the community, go to confession, whatever it is. When you've solved that problem, come back. And I think that's the Catholics, or that's the Christian, and I would hope everybody, that if you try to live a joyful life and not go after perfect peace, because you're not going to get perfect peace, what St. Augustine said. Right. I think that's a good way of doing it. Anyway. You asked me about how I think things are in general in the world. I remember in 1956, Ike and Dick ran against Adlai Stevenson and who was it, Estes? Oh, I forget who the...
Kiefer,
right. Mm-hmm. So I was 8 years old, I remember that. And then I remember watching the Kennedy-Nixon debates. Yep. And what was going on in black and white TV and stuff. And I've asked some of the military history and political history experts at West Point, and you're not going to get a better place to find out about that.
That's true.
West Point. I says, is it true that many political analysts felt that Nixon beat Kennedy on the radio, but not on TV? And they all said, yes. But Kennedy is this vibrant, good-looking Irish Catholic with a quip and stuff.
And Kennedy accepted the use of makeup, and Nixon refused. Right.
That I didn't know.
Yeah.
Close your eyes and I'll
I grew up in the 60s, and that's my favorite decade because they were turbulent and they were wonderful. I went from 12 to 22, and there was Vatican II, the British invasion, sexual revolution, the Vietnam War, the assassinations, men went on the moon, what was the thing, Woodstock, and all of this stuff. But in all honesty, even with the violence, I never remember anybody saying that they wanted America to go down. At least that's my recollection. So when I was hospitalized, we had 3 channels on the TV. They had Blue Bloods, and I got hooked on Blue Bloods. I love Blue Bloods. Any guy with a mustache like that.
That's right. It looks like it. Your Tom Selleck looks like you a little bit.
But the other 2 things was that one channel had Trump as the 4th person of the Trinity, and the other as a spawn of the devil. And I kept thinking, what if I came from Mars? And I'm watching TV. Who do I believe? And I like to think as a kid, going back to the 60s with Huntley Brinkley and Walter Cronkite.
Eric Sevareid.
Right, that we weren't overpowered with this. So, even before AI, I've told the cadets, my cadets, I said, look, there's so much stuff coming at you. You can't process it all. So step back a little bit. Be careful. Try to filter it. See what's what. Try to get to objective truth. How about you, bro?
No, I mean, when I think about the current world we live in, it is a very, in some ways, a similar world to we grew up in the 60s. I still remember having this fear that we would be under a nuclear attack.
When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it.
The Cold War took its toll on even young children, fearing about that. I still remember having the designated fallout shelters in our schools with that very iconic yellow and black sign with that nuclear symbol on it. That was, we were being told in those days, if there's a nuclear attack, go on the floor and hide under your desk, as if that would have done bupkis, right? But they were trying to give us some sense of power, some sense of agency. What do you do? And so we are in that kind of the doomsday clock continues to get closer. The thing that really frightens me every single day is how it is becoming increasingly difficult to separate what is true and what is false.
Thank you. Exactly.
And if there's a way you want to destroy society is diffuse and disallow communication. And if you cannot allow the medium nor the message, then you've really destroyed communication. I'm afraid of that. I think my children, now my daughter's 37, my son is 33. He's not in a relationship. My daughter is married to this wonderful woman, but at one time they were thinking of adopting a child, and that's no longer in their plans, I think, because I think they do not feel safe in bringing a child into this world. When I became a parent, I wasn't unhappy with the world. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't terribly unhappy. And I thought there was a lot to be gained by having a child join the world. And I still feel that way, but I think that's diminished across society. So I'm very worried about where we are. And again, I go back to what we've been talking about in some sense. What's missing are these deep relationships where people feel safe. I don't think people feel safe anymore,
If I can add a thing, what my brother's saying about almost like what Pilate said, what is truth? I think one of my brother's favorite quotes and mine is, I believe it's by Chesterton, that a statement is never so false as when it is almost the truth. When something is almost the truth, but you just give that little hook, and how do you know? How do you know? Right.
I also have this thought every so often that in 100 years, none of us are going to be around. We kind of live our lives as if we are the end of it all, like we are the most important people, that ever existed before and after. In 100 years, going to be a whole new bunch of people who are on this planet leading our the lives that are being. And so, in some sense, I try to, Thomas More. One of my favorites is Francis of Assisi. My second favorite is Thomas More, the political Thomas More. Right? Thomas More used to have a sign on his desk that had two signs. One of them was "Me third." It was always God, my family, and me third. And the second was "It will pass." If you got a good thing happening, you became chancellor, it'll pass. You're going to get beheaded, it'll pass. Whatever the outcome is. And so I feel, in many ways, where I try to arrive in is to try to not get too wrapped up into the craziness of it. I try to stay informed. One of my personal sins is watching CNN too much because I'm a news junkie. I listen all the time for these statements that just drive me crazy, that worry me about the world. My wife is the opposite. My wife doesn't want to turn the TV on forget that stuff, just live our lives, live our family, live our friends. I'm somewhere stuck in the world, but I try not to let it get me down. That's a tough one. I have to say, that's a tough one for me, you know.
What bothers me on that, what my brother said, and I think it's much more possible now than when I was a kid. I have two friends who I met in high school, good friends and stuff, and they got involved a few years ago with the political election. And it doesn't matter who backed Trump and who backed Biden or Harris, but they know each other since 1962. Yeah, we graduated in 1962. No, they knew each other from grammar school, so perhaps as early as 1953. They don't talk to each other anymore. I want to get both their heads and bang their heads together. What is wrong with you? You were going to let this break up a friendship? And so that's why I could see where Kelly would say, hey, I just don't want to hear.
I'm troubled by that only because...
Yeah, you can't put your head in the ground either, right.
You can't put your head in the ground. And I also think in some sense biblical, it's brother will turn against brother, father will turn against son, son against father. These are the times that speak to such human values. And Gabe, I tried so hard, and the solution I have, which I think is probably one, Gabe, that you wish these guys would have. I've identified some friends who I care deeply for, and I will not speak about politics. I'm mixed about that, by the way, as a solution. I'm very ambivalent about that as a solution, but I live with that because I don't want to create an environment where we see each other and we're angry at each other, or my wife is angry at me.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not a good solution.
Yeah, I think if people say, hey, look, I don't want to get, I'm not going to lose this friendship over this. So, and to have a conversation, two of you have to do it. And I say, look, I just don't want to talk about that. And because it goes from, well, here's the position, and then it goes, well, wait a minute, how can you do this? Well, anyone who thinks that is got, and then it just escalates, and say, I'm going to punch you in the nose.
But I'm unhappier in this world than I've ever been in my life. Yeah. This is the unhappiness.
It's scary. I think it's scary. And at West Point, that's the top technological, they don't know anything about AI. They're very conscious of it, but I think they're all saying we're just at the tip of the iceberg. We don't know where this is going. I mean, in some sense, this is much more dangerous than nuclear bombs, because at least with nuclear bombs, as tenuous as it could be, you can have countries keeping each other in check. Mm-hmm. But if you don't know what you're reading is true, and that's where the devil comes in. Satan is the father of lies.
I teach both graduate students and undergraduates in the field of psychology, education, human development. And I think that the undergraduate student in 2025 is a very different undergraduate student than I think I've known of in the past, because they have been, I think, throughout their development, overwhelmed by more media than they can process. I think they have a difficult time discerning, in some sense, truth from fiction, but discerning what's important to attend to and what's not important to attend to. I also think that they're attached so much to social media that I don't think I've seen a capacity for quiet reflection. Right. I think there's always noise in their head, whether it's real noise from an earphone or something or a media thing, or it's just the stuff in their head that rattles around from they've heard. So that worries me about the current student, that they are a little bit overwhelmed by so many fronts and have a hard time discerning what is good information and what's valid and what's accurate, On the other hand, I do find, and this is true for the undergraduate and graduates, I find every so often a student that has this freaking spark of excitement about learning and about education and about life. And it says to me, well, what I said to you earlier, we're not going to be here in 100 years. There's going to be a generation of people who can bring us along, these next couple of years. I mean, there's good people out there, and the students are there. So oddly enough, I know I began this message on a dark note. I actually think I ended on a positive note. I'm kind of excited about the students I've been working with and seeing, you know.
For the most part, I teach undergraduate students, although every now and then I'll have a graduate student that was working with a graduate student in differential equations on her dissertation, but that was a number of years ago. And there are times I teach in the School of Theology at Seton Hall. I might have a different answer for this in a year, but right now, as I end up West Point is a unique situation. It's a formational school. It's very much like a seminary, because the ultimate goal is not necessarily to get a diploma, although you've got to get one, but it's to become commissioned, almost like ordained. You're empowered. And the parallels between the seminary and the academy are amazing. In fact, just this past weekend, or this past Friday, it was the beginning of the Family Day weekend, and parents came into my office with their sons or daughters. And these are plebes, these are freshmen, and you look at the pride. And I says, I can't imagine how proud you are. And now I'm teaching an advanced plebe math course, and this is like the highest group of them. So it's like the best of the best of the best. And these kids are off the charts.
Yeah, yeah.
And I say, you know, and we talked about this, you know, how do you look at the future? I says, when I look at these young men and women, I'm not worried. They're getting the best possible education. Now, I realize not every place is West Point, and West Point has its own issue. I tell people, West Point's not heaven. It's close, but it's not heaven. And there are issues. But even when you go into the gates, you're not only going to a place, it's like you're going back in time. And you have Lee and Grant and Bradley, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and you see the statues almost like statues of saints in a monastery or in a retreat. So, but I suspect when I'm back at Seton Hall next year, I think things will change a little bit, but they have a great education there, and it is a Catholic school. And I'm hoping, and my experience has been, that the presence of the priests and the Blessed Sacrament has really had its benefits. We have our problems, but we all do, right? Every place we're going to have issues. But what my brother said at the very end with the technology and the media, that scares me. I mean, I'm driving my car, and people, sometimes adults, mostly high school kids and maybe college kids, are walking. They got, I don't know what we call those white things, earbuds or something.
Earbuds, I think they're called earbuds, right? Yeah.
And they're looking at their phones, not even saying thank you. They just are walking across the street.
Oh, sure.
And I don't see them as engaged with one another. I don't think they're playing ball. I don't even think they're doing video games a lot.
And that even happens at tables in restaurants.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Yeah. You're seeing the mother and the father and the kids. I'm saying, what is going on here? Or groups are walking and they're all on their phones.
So Gabe shared a statement with me once, and you'll correct me if I'm misattributing it. I don't know if it was another Thomas Aquinas statement or it was Chesterton speaking about Aquinas in the Dumb Ox, in the book The Dumb Ox. But he applied this concept to sexuality or sex.
Right, that's right.
But I apply it to technology. Right. The statement is, the minute sex ceases to be your servant, it becomes your tyrant. I say that about technology. So do I, The minute technology ceases to be your servant, it becomes your tyrant. Yeah. And that's where we are. Yeah. Technology has become our tyrant. I don't know, and I don't have the skill set to sometimes disentangle what is true and what is not, what is AI and what is not. I'll look at a video, and for the life of me, I cannot imagine that this subject would say this thing, and yet I see it on video, and it's leading me to do something that once we do this, will never be the same, which is to no longer trust your senses.
That's right.
To no longer trust your eyes or your ears. And when you are in that situation, we are doomed. And so I think there is a logarithmic escalation of the damage of technology, and we are spinning into a world where the technology is no longer serving it well. For all of the benefits in diagnostics, medicine, or communication, all of that stuff, the unintended side effects have been worse. So I can understand why people want to live off the grid, where they want to find their farm, grow their own stuff, live away from this all. Have no TV, So that worries me, I have to say, about the world we're in today.
I'd like to talk about my old friends. So Gerard, of course, went to the seminary when he was 13 years old, and he had friends, but a number of friends he also met in the seminary. I know that one of his best friends is a priest, Father Vinny Fortunato. But I got to tell you about my oldest friend, Frank Matola. We were in the kindergarten together, but I didn't meet him at the beginning of the kindergarten, and it was like my brother experienced in the day center. I remember when my mother dropped me off at the kindergarten, she left and everyone was crying. Everyone was crying. So we had two teachers, Miss Murata, who was a good cop, and Miss Frank, who was the bad cop. I'm sitting next to this girl, Catherine Egan, and this part is actually tragic. So Catherine Egan tells me one day, now I'm only 5 years old, that I was going to die in 1,000,000 days. So I don't know if you remember this.
You told me this story.
So anyway, 1,000,000 days. So I go home and I start crying. This is another reason why I became a mathematician.
That's right, yeah,
I wanted to find out how much I was going to live.
That's right.
So anyway, I go home. My mother says, I'm going to move your chair. So we go in, and she says, look, I want my son moved to another table. So I remember it was either Miss Frank or Miss Murata got my chair and put me next to Frank Matola. And we've been friends ever since. Let's see.
And you died a slower death.
Yeah, I did. Let's see. He named his daughter Gabriel after me. I was best man for his first marriage. I married the second marriage, and best man for the third marriage. He had all sorts of canon laws and everything.
Still working on it.
So, and he's an expert in everything. I love him dearly, but he's the world's foremost authority. He's a musician, a great musician. But as far as Catherine Egan, I must tell you, she was playing on the railroad tracks a few years later and actually had her legs chopped off. This true story. But she somehow survived. I don't know how that happened.
Well.
And as far as I know, Catherine Egan is still alive. So, yeah. But that was Frank, and Frank used to get his hair pulled by Miss Diderine because he was just being bad in class. Other friends I had were Jimmy Vincenti. Of all my friends, Jimmy I met in the 9th grade. His childhood and mine were most alike. His mother died, though, when he was very young, when he was, I think, 13. And his father, who was from Italy, was 49 when he was born, when Jim was born. So he had a tough life, but he married a wonderful woman. Then there's Kenny Reardon, who was in he was Hoboken and went to Staten Island. Now he's in Florida. Bobby Lemke, guys I still keep in touch with, and I'm very, very fortunate, very fortunate. And there were some girls I still keep in touch with on a platonic level, but it's good. I think that the most important thing is to love. I really do.
Yeah, amen. Amen.
What did St. Augustine say? Love God and do what you will.
Do what you wish, right? I was like, that's what you said, yeah.
Anyway, how about you, bro?
My friendships growing up probably centered around two neighborhoods of sorts. One was St. Anne's Church, my home parish. I was an altar boy there, and the altar boys had their own community of sorts. We would get together every Saturday for a meeting with the priest overseeing the altar boys, but that also always morphed into playing a game of box ball or playing stickball, doing some kind of fun together, and among those people were some of my closest friends. My best friend growing up, a fellow named Johnny Zamet, who just passed away about 2 years ago. And so that was one neighborhood, and the second neighborhood was wherever we grew up. And so when Gabe and I lived in the house, 309 2nd Street, that's the house that burned down with the Christmas tree, It was right next door to a chicken market, and they used to sell live chickens. And so we remember hearing the cackle of chickens all the time, and they were in these wooden crates. And sometimes whenever they would, someone would come in and want to buy a live chicken, they would chop the head off, and sometimes the chicken would run around without their head. I mean, a chicken without a head is a real thing that happens, right? There was a guy working there whose name was Reno. Reno was a friend of Gabe's, a little older than me, but still a friend of mine. And he and his brother, Nate, who've both passed away since then, Nate and Reno, were the children of this well-known pizzeria in Hoboken called Leo's Rendezvous. Anyone who goes to Hoboken to this day goes to Leo's Rendezvous. And so Reno mostly, sometimes Nate, and some other friends in that block. David Bellizzi was on the corner. Remember David Bellizzi on the corner? And that was a neighborhood of friends we would play with all the time. And so there were three. There was that one. There was the projects. When we moved to the projects, I had a circle of friends, which was such a cool circle. So I have to say that playing in the streets, even the words we would use, I would come home from school and I would say to my mother, I'm putting my play clothes on.
That's right.
We used that phrase, play clothes, like you were dressed for church, now you could do play clothes and dressed for school. So I have to say I grew up, and Kelly, Gabe and I both would agree, I think. And I say Kelly because my wife had a similar neighborhood of friends. They put plays on and do all these things. I loved growing up in Hoboken because the neighborhoods were there, and your social network was big growing up. At the time we grew up in Hoboken, the main street is called Washington Street. And Hoboken by that time had not yet been gentrified. Mm-hmm. So lots of new folks haven't come into the town. People weren't moving out because it was unaffordable. There were migration of different groups. By the time we grew up, the Irish and Italian immigrations had already occurred. The Latin American migrations were starting. And so the town was changing. But in Hoboken, the streets going north and south are linear. So 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street, up to 14th Street, I think, right? You could walk from 1st Street to 14th Street on any given day and meet 70, 80 people you knew. Everybody knew each other in Hoboken. You knew them. If I walked into Hoboken now, because it's a different neighborhood, I wouldn't, maybe 2 or 3, I'm lucky enough if they're old like me. So that's the one thing I remember. Hoboken always had a small town feel to it, and for that I was so grateful, because Hoboken was a great place to grow up, So the neighborhoods of friends is the one thing that stands out so much in my mind,
And it was safe.
It
People made fun of Hoboken, and I never know why. I mean, at Stevens Tech, home of Frank Sinatra, home of the first professional baseball game, and I forget if it was World War I or World War II, where they said Heaven, Hell, or Hoboken.
That's right, Heaven, Hell, or Hoboken.
World War I. So this is where people were going to wind up from the war, either Heaven, Hell, or the docks of Hoboken.
Hoboken was a major port.
That's right,
that the ships came into to sail out to the conflicts.
There were 5 Catholic churches in Hoboken. I don't know if you remember this, but we're Italian American, obviously. But the real Italians, we call them the Italians. And when we would play war, we'd conveniently forget that Italy was on the wrong side. So anyway.
By the way, I have it inside. My grandfather has a medal signed by Mussolini. I have it inside. I have it in our archives. Yes, so he was in World War I. He was part of World War I and World War II. He was part of. I'm sorry.
Well, Siegfried Banke, that's the kid whose mother my father gave food to that time.
The one who said, "My husband's a nut too."
Yeah. They were the Germans, but we were the Americans.
That's right.
So one day I get into a fight with 2 Italian kids, Reno and Mike. Now, if you remember, bro, on the corner of 2nd and Willow Avenue, there was a fruit store.
Yep.
So we had a snowball fight in the summer. Instead of throwing snow, we threw fruit. But it was 2 against 1, and they had all the weapons. So it was that simple.
That's right. They won.
So they're throwing all this crap over and stuff. Now, the woman who owned the place was an Italian woman, right? This is before the Aveblos came.
Now, this isn't near the Yum Yum place, was it? No, it's a block away from the Yum Yum place?
No, let's see. It would be, if you crossed the street from 309 2nd Street and,
Right.
and walked up to the corner,
Right.
there was a fruit store. Remember?
All right,
A
okay,
fruit
yeah,
and
I think so.
vegetable.
Yeah, I got you.
In fact, it wasn't far from
Not
the
far from
daycare.
St. Mary's.
And not far from the daycare center.
Oh, that's
We
a
went-
Memorial Day,
That's
right down the
right.
block. Okay.
So anyway, so these guys are doing things. But the woman downstairs would wash the sidewalk, and she was not a nice lady. And you could eat off the sidewalk. She'd wash the sidewalk and stuff. So she always peeked out the blinds. I know I didn't tell you this. She always peeked out the blinds. So one day I'm coming home from school, and so if you go upstairs, and it was 3 or 4 steps into the front door, she would look out the window. So this one day I decide to be perpendicular to her. So if she's looking at me and I'm making all these faces like this, I'm just going like this, sticking out my tongue or whatever. And I know that she's taking this all in. So she told my mother, "What's wrong with your kid?" I said, "What are you talking about?" I saw him make all these faces. "Gabe, did you do anything?" "No, Ma, I didn't do anything." I said, "I got to go to confession now." "No, Ma, I didn't do anything." But what happened, so these kids get the better of me in a fight. They're throwing things. I know I'm going to catch a beating. So I go upstairs and I tell my mother, I said, "Ma, I got into a fight with Nicky and Mikey and they threw stuff." "Oh," she said, "your father's going to," because I knew the woman would get, "But you know what your rotten kid did." So my mother locks the door and I says, "Ma, that's not going to stop that." So, they come in, hits it, I caught a beating for that, but any day that ended in Y. But what you wind up with, or what I wind up with, which I think is very, very common with ACOAs, adult children of alcoholics. I've done a lot of reading on that. You almost come up to the conclusion that it's better if the alcoholic who you live with is always bad, rather than you don't know what you're going to find. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Absolutely.
And so, when my father was in a good mood, and then of course you're waiting for the shoe to drop.
Right.
And
I think that's true.
I remember another times Gerard and I are playing ball outside. And you remember that the room with the desk and the phone, and we had a toy box.
Yeah, the front room. Yeah.
And so I said, "Dad, can you throw out a ball?" We had like a lot of ball, a rubber ball. He gets the whole box and throws out. And I got my friends there. Said, "No, Dad, all I want is," and I knew exactly what was happening. He was angry.
It's interesting you say that, and this is part of, back to our story, and maybe this is not talking about the neighborhoods, but you just triggered, living with a father who was abusive to our mother, sometimes to us, but more to my mother, I think, although you've got the brunt of that more. We learned early on, one of the most painful things about alcoholism is the secrecy that's surrounding it. You try so hard to make excuses for your parent. I went to seminary in September 1965 and took a Greyhound bus with my father from New York City, Greyhound, to Stanton, Virginia, where the seminary was at the time. And he took me there. My father actually, we took a bus from Hoboken to Port Authority, and then Port Authority, even to this day, if you go outside, there's all of these big shops with big glass displays, and there was an electric guitar that I liked. And my father didn't have much money. He wasn't working. He was on disability. He bought me an electric guitar right then and there. So I wound up going to Virginia with my trunk that was in the Greyhound compartment, with my clothes and a cardboard box in the shape of a guitar. I was there for 1 full year, for my freshman year, came home for the summer, and then went back for my second year. And in December of my sophomore year, that would be 65, 66, the seminary was moving from Stanton, Virginia to Newton, New Jersey. They had just built a brand new seminary there, beautiful place. The seminary knew that a lot of the kids from the New York area could all benefit if they chartered a bus instead of all of us having our families go and get Greyhound from Stanton, Virginia, they chartered a bus and we drove up with that bus from Stanton, Virginia, and they decided Hoboken would be a great hub for everybody else because there's a train station there and families from outside of the area could come to Hoboken. So that bus kept getting delayed because the bus had these old tires that kept flapping, breaking off. The bus driver would go out with a knife and cut off a chunk of the tire because it was flapping. And so we wound up getting there 3-4 hours late than my father expected us to be. My father was supposed to meet us at a certain time at the subway station where the bus was stopping and take me in. He was 4 hours delayed. And what did he do for 4 hours? Drank himself silly, right? So we wind up getting to Hoboken. I see my father clearly. Gabe and I learned you can tell from a moment if you're drunk. We are so good to this day at detecting drunk people. I'm really good. It's like a sixth sense, right? I knew he was drunk. And he's staggering a bit and he's slurring. And he was driving me and two of my friends and one of our priests to St. Anne's Church to take them home there and take me home. And so I remembered thinking, Father Peter Nicosia, by the way, he was the director of our priest. Father Peter and me and two of my buddies, I think John Sherwood and Ralph Schell, drive to St. Anne's Church, and all the time I'm saying to the priest, Father Peter, the director, yeah, Father, I'm so sorry. My father was really working so hard. He's so tired. I know he looks kind of exhausted. Trying to come up with an excuse as to why this guy was clearly swerving and shouldn't be driving and slurring. And Father Peter was so kind. Peter Nicosia was such a kind priest. He said, "Oh, Gerry, I got it. Don't worry," and never once made me feel badly. But that's a memory that's iconic for me because it resembles other times in my life where you had to cover for your father.
You had to cover, sure.
You had to cover for your father. So, but that's a Hoboken story. And then the next January, we moved up to the new seminary.
I'd like to talk a little bit about our mother. Now, both she and my father buried two kids, and so it took a toll on my father too, but my father just did what he did, and my mother took care of us. And we took care of her. Then the time came after my father died, and she was a very good-looking woman, that Gerard and I both were united in saying, we got to get Mom married. We got preferably to someone in California. So, now we loved her very much. One time, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. One about Ralph Lopez. That's
Ralph Lopez, yeah, and the other was the doctor. The doctor who wanted to throw his mother off the balcony with a wheelchair. Remember that?
No, that I don't remember.
Yeah, we finished this one first.
Okay. So my mother's in a nursing home. And so Gerard and I, he didn't like this, but this was best for my mother. It was a Catholic nursing home, and we had somebody there every day. So Gerard volunteered to be part of the board, and I volunteered to be a chaplain. So I'd go there, hear confession, say Mass. One day I'm saying Mass. Now my mother at this point has no filter. So she's sitting there, and my dear brother, who I love a lot, is in the back. Now, of course, no one can see him except me. So I'm at the altar, and this guy next to her corpse, she looks like this. And Gerard realizes this is going to be fun. And Gerard starts laughing, smiling. And then another guy, corpse, another one corpse. Then someone sneezes. Stop it! And Gerard is laughing back. And I'm thinking, I got to get through Mass. I don't know.
She was, yeah.
So then after Mass, he said, Mom, what'd you do? Now, my mother never met a lie she didn't like. So I said, Mom, what'd you do? I didn't do anything. Yes, you did. What did I do? Well, you said these things, stuff. Well, they shouldn't have sneezed at your Mass or whatever. But the Ralph Lopez story I have to tell you now, there's a background to this. This woman by the name of Rachel married this guy, Ralph Lopez. Now, Ralph's family was really Italian, but they wound up in South America, I think.
I think that's true.
Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Well, Ralph Lopez was this big, fat, jolly man, as I remember him as a kid. And his son, Ralph, went to the seminary for a while.
That's right. Yeah.
And his wife was a beautiful woman by the name of Rachel. And Rachel and my mother were great friends. So years later, Ralph Lopez slims down, and he looks very, very good. I mean, he almost looked like a Don. And he looked, anyway.
A good-looking fellow, he was.
So I visited someone in the hospital, and my mother was with me. It turned out that was the moment Rachel died. And I'm a priest now, and I got my oils. So it's one of the moments where you say, well, if someone had to die, I'm glad I was here. So Ralph Lopez is obviously, he's feeling bad. He's on his wife. He's crying, all of this. So I do what a priest has to do. This was a Sunday. The funeral was a Wednesday. So I celebrated at the funeral with Father Alexander.
Davis.
Right. And so I celebrated. And then after the Mass, Mr. Lopez says, Father, I want to take you out for dinner. I said, that's not necessary. He said, no, I want to talk to you about something. I said, okay, well, I have Mass on Saturday at St. Benedict's. He said, I'll come there. And we'll go to an Italian restaurant. So we go to this restaurant, it's like a big, long car. He says, look, I want to thank you for what you did. I said, no, that's just what a priest does. He says, but I want to talk to you about a personal matter. He says, I want to date your mother. I says, Dad? I said, my brother will escort her down the aisle, and I'll do the wedding.
We're ready to give her away.
It's in California. So anyway, now, there's a sub-story to this that I didn't know at the time. But I did tell him, I said, look, nothing would make me happy but please go slow with her. Well, he proceeds to tell her in Italian that she's too close to her family, her sister and stuff. You know that ain't gonna go anywhere. But what I didn't know is that, and this is not funny, but in the telling is, at the wake, which would have been Tuesday night, my mother is sitting next to Ralph, and then she decides to go up to the casket and then leave. Well, he's checking out her legs. I didn't know this, but he told my mother this. I was looking at your legs, and her answer, you son of a bitch, your wife is not even cold and stuff. That was funny.
Yes.
And so I told him.
Bad timing. Right?
Anytime I wanted to give my mother a hard time, say, hey, Ma, that's Mr. Lopez. And he called, stop it.
I'd become a pretty good friend with a Lutheran priest who was the pastor of a church in Hoboken. I was the Head Start director in Hoboken, and so I had been the first full year Head Start program, and I was the director, and I started in '78. And we were still looking for a permanent site for the Head Start program. We had been funded, and we temporarily rented space from the Lutheran Church of Hoboken. There was only one Lutheran church, St. Matthew's on 8th and Hudson. So I had befriended the pastor and his wife. They were both dear friends of mine, and I was on some city committees for them. What I didn't know at the time is that the pastor had been diagnosed with a bipolar disorder and also was an alcoholic, which is sometimes comorbidity. The alcoholism and bipolar disorders are often co-occurring. Anyway, long and the short of it is I invited them up, as we often would do, inviting friends to my mother's house for dinner because she would cook a nice gravy, Italian gravy, which is sauce, but we Italians call it gravy. And anyway, he came, well, in the middle of it all, he drank a little bit too much.
We didn't know he had
And we didn't know he was a drinker, and suddenly he starts behaving a little badly, including at one point when my mother got up, he kind of swatted her and put his whole hand on her ass, and held it there for a while. And I'm thinking, oh my God, please, dear God, save us from this moment, But we got through it.
She turned around and she wanted to hit him.
Yeah, I think she
over
wanted
the
to
head.
slap him silly.
And my brother's looking at police, and I'm laughing. I said, oh, this is too funny.
The part of the story I've really wanted to talk about was why I was thinking at first of becoming a Catholic priest, a Franciscan priest, but found another way in my life. And so I had been very active in my home parish of St. Anne's in Hoboken, and the church where my father was baptized, I was married and baptized. My children were baptized, and it had a great meaning in my life growing up. I was an altar boy there, and when I entered the seminary, it was to be a Capuchin Franciscan priest of the kind that was there in that parish. And so I spent 6 years in seminary, 4 years high school, 2 years college. And at the time, when we went from high school to college, we had 4 majors that we could declare. We could either major in history, in English, in theology, or psychology. Those were the only 4 majors we seminarians were allowed to have. And I chose in my freshman year at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, because our seminary was in Beacon, New York, I chose psychology. It seemed of those 4 options, it seemed to be the one that aligned mostly with me. And even though a year later I left the seminary, or 2 years later, I left at the end of my sophomore year in college, and I went to St. Peter's College in New Jersey, in Jersey City, I kept psychology as a major. And so I stayed with that through my undergraduate career, and then decided to apply for graduate programs that focused on child development, developmental psychology. I think the reason why I chose child development or developmental psychology is because I've always had a fascination about myself in growing up. And I had this real interest, even as a young boy, in sort of understanding children and looking at children. And I had a real warm spot in my heart. I feel like Miss America, you know, I always wanted to work with children, but there was something about children that fascinated me. And I think in retrospect, it was because I sort of wondered, you know, how I made it through my own life and my own story, and that led me to the field. And so I wound up pursuing my PhD in psychology at Temple University, and stayed in the field, always looking for opportunities that would be focusing on younger and younger children. During graduate school, I had the opportunity, after my 2 years of full-time coursework, or 3 years of full-time coursework, to become a Head Start director in my hometown in Hoboken. They were just expanding Head Start at that point, 1978, from a summer program to a full-year program, and they needed to hire a full-time director, and I applied and got the job, which is actually where I met Kelly, my wife, your mother, your grandmother, whoever in your life she is. And so that led me to really think a lot about services for children, young children. Head Start at the time was for 3 to 5 year olds. And as I continued to work in that field, I began to become interested in the clinical aspects, not just research and teaching in human development, but the clinical aspects. And so I actually then began to work at the Community Mental Health Center at Christ Hospital in Jersey City, around my Head Start days, and that's when I began to engage in practice as a psychotherapist under supervision. And then from that, as I continued to pursue my doctorate, I became a licensed psychologist. I applied for licensure and had all the kinds of supervision you need to do that. And so it began to take me away from just administrative work to more clinical work. And that, in turn, led me to learn about this field. 1987 or 88, I learned about this field called infant mental health. My daughter was born right after I finished my oral defense in 1988, and I traveled to this institute in Illinois for a little time to learn about infant mental health, the Infant Parent Institute. And so from there, it's kind of history. I came back from that and have been working in the field of infant mental health since then, and actually started 2 centers, the YCS Institute for Infant and Preschool Mental Health in 2000, and in 2011 I started the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health at Montclair State University, and they both are continuing to function. This is 2025, so they continue to survive and function and contribute, I think, in wonderful ways to the state of affairs with regard to infants and young children. So part of my story, part of my legacy, I hope, has been to really find that shift from psychology to working with younger and younger children and bring about systems change for their betterment. The nature of human attachment is such that we humans cannot grow without relationships. In evolution, if you compare human infants to other large mammals, human infants are incredibly helpless at birth compared to the mammals of the young of other larger mammals, right? Like a horse or a cow, right? Cattle, calf. And there's a term in evolution that I use and we teach about in our program called secondary altriciality. Humans are an altricial species. We are a species that requires nurturing. And without nurturing, right, we will not function. There's a very well-known figure in the field of infant mental health, Donald Winnicott, who said there's no such thing as a baby, only a baby and another. And if you think of a baby alone, you're thinking of a dead baby. So we can't take relationships for granted, you know. I often talk in my clinical work about a very difficult case I worked with many, many years ago of a 12-year-old girl who was 6 months pregnant when I first met her. She had been in 32 different foster homes, 32 different placements. How could she feel some sense of consistency, predictability, reliability, security, safety, trust in her world, right? So the infant-parent relationship to me parallels the responsibility that we have as parents to what creators have to think about. There's nothing more godly than trying to be a good parent, to try to bring this child to creation and then shepherd this child. We do not own our children. We are shepherds of our children. We don't own them in that regard, which means we have a lot to do. And that's what, by the way, led me to really feel a lot of passion about the field of infant mental health, the infant-parent relationship, because once I recognized that that's where it begins. And so that, again, I feel fortunate to be in the career I love, you know.
My guest today is Dr. Gerard Costa, the director of the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health, a division of the College of Education and Human Services at Montclair State University. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Thank you for
Hi,
being with
Stephanie.
me today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Dr. Costa, let's start with you.
Many times children with autism and other developmental difficulties, in part because their neurosensory system is more sensitive, can sometimes have as a byproduct of that anxiety. So many times children become anxious when the world doesn't feel as comfortable to them. And so we have to think about even some early childhood mental health interventions that typically schools are not that well trained in or educated about. I think those are needed. But there's a concept in education that's so critical called differentiated instruction, where we really have to be better able to identify what works for this particular child. The core curriculum standards are there for all children. And many times children with autism cannot learn in the same way that a neurotypical child might. So educators really need lots of help in figuring out how to modify instructional strategies that really help this particular child learn.
Yes.
What we have learned about brain development in the last 15, 20 years is overwhelmingly clear about the importance of earliest experiences. So at 5 months gestation, just to give you some idea of our brain systems, 80 to 100 billion neurons, nerve cells, are in our brain. At birth, about 20% of those neurons have these kind of interconnections. 80% of the connections that form both across our hemispheres and from lower centers to higher centers to have a fully balanced and integrated brain, 80% of those connections occur post-birth. So the brain is experience dependent. It's waiting for those early experiences to begin to hardwire. There's evidence that children with autism have certain brain regions that are overly responsive or under responsive to certain experiences. So early experiences will tailor those, help remediate those. Every nerve cell of those 80 to 100 billion neurons can make up to 10,000 connections a day. And so those connections are 10,000 connections a minute, I'm sorry. So these are remarkable, remarkable opportunities that if we don't invest in early intervention now, and we're doing more, but not enough, especially birth to 3.
Now, my life, pretty much all of it. I'm a mathematician and a priest, and I got all my degrees except for theology in Hoboken, in the square mile. Went from the kindergarten to a PhD. One of the few people
Grammar
to do
school,
that.
high school, college, graduate school,
And your father and I, or Gerry and I, are very close. And it's been a great life. And your grandfather, Phil, unfortunately, you didn't meet him because I think that you would have really been a very positive influence on him. But your grandmother, as you know, loved you very much, probably loved you more than she loved us. I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but if you remember at the homily at her Mass, I alluded to that. But Grandma was a character too, and she taught us something about math by playing numbers. She loved numbers, and she was great. I remember a story once I picked up Grandma in Hoboken. I was going to take her to St. Benedict's in Newark, and I had to go over the Pulaski Skyway. Well, there was a tractor trailer in front of us, and on the back of the bus, on the back of the trailer, was the number 597. And my mother said, Gabe, look, that's your ordination date. And I'm thinking, gee, is she losing it? I said, Mom, what do you mean it's my ordination date? I was ordained in May of 79. It's 579. She said, that's 597. You're a mathematician and you don't know what a box is? That's a box. It's a different combination. So that was my mom. And she was a character. And anyway, somehow or other, oh, by the way, Grandpa Phil, he was very good in math as well. In fact, he learned that working at his father and mother's store where they didn't have adding machines, and he had to write down on the paper bag what the prices were, and he added up. In fact, I worked there as well. I don't know if your father worked there.
Briefly, yeah.
Briefly. Well, anyway, Grandma introduced me, along with Aunt Elizabeth, they introduced me to gambling. And believe it or not, I didn't like it until I got there. And in addition to the cocktail waitresses, I said, this is not a bad place to be. So, and because I'm a mathematician, I've decided to, maybe I can apply this. And I'll tell you a true story. I was at a casino. It was in Pennsylvania. I was there alone this time. And I get a telephone call from the Archdiocese. And the woman who called was Roseanne, who had been a parishioner of mine in my first parish, St. Francis Xavier. And Roseanne said, Father, the Archbishop wants to talk to you. And I was at the casino. So I said to Roseanne, I tell you what, Roseanne, can I call you back in 2 minutes? Because I didn't think it would be nice with the machines going and this and that going on and on. So she said, sure, Father, no problem. So I go outside. I said, hello, Archbishop. Yes, Father, I'm sorry to bother you. I said, no. He said, what were you doing? I says, well, you know, I'm a mathematician. I was at a professional exercise. I was at a probability seminar. And he said, oh, that's very good of you, very professional. And then after 3 seconds, I said, sometimes they call it a casino. Well, 3 seconds later, he just cracked up and roared and stuff. So anyway, but I think I'm partly responsible for your father getting involved in this.
Unfortunately,
so, by the way, we went yesterday and your father won $600.
So I came home with 600 more than I started, right?
600, so he did very, very well. And I know
And you
that
did
Phil
too.
likes to go every now and then. So the question comes up a lot of times, because I'm a priest and a mathematician, don't these areas contradict? And my answer is a resounding no. I believe there's only one author of truth, and that's God. I think St. Thomas Aquinas said that anytime anyone utters truth with no exception and at all times. It's under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And me personally, and just to kind of tie in some personal stuff, when you live in a way with an alcoholic, you don't know where the boundaries are, so you don't know where things are going to be good or bad. Well, mathematics has none of that. It's pretty much what you see is what you get.
Yeah.
In fact, it's the only area I believe where you have a theorem, because just about every other area have theories, because the scientific method is basically observation, and then you try to put, you want to call it a math model, fine. But do you really know it's always true? I mean, how do you know everyone
That's right.
has a different DNA or fingerprint, unless you test everyone? And then once a baby is born, you got to do it again. Anyway, I've always loved math, and I think that math also gives us something that's so austere. And it's like Bertrand Russell said, something to the effect of a purest form of art, almost like sculpture. It stands by itself. And I wonder from a theological point of view, I'm thinking about investigating this, is it possible to show, at least in a qualitative way, that mathematics was relatively less impacted by original sin than almost
interesting.
all other aspects of creation? And I bounced that off some theologians, because everything else seems to have been, has been affected, but mathematics, there's an exactness there, a precision, a perfection. And just to end up, even including baseball, there is a book of Numbers in the Bible.
In the Bible, that's right.
And there's a book of Ruth in the Bible.
That's right.
So the Mets have Lamentations.
That-
And I'll stop with that. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist.
I love it. I love
I
it.
couldn't
Right?
resist.
An analogous story about the sort of unification of my spiritual and faith life to my life as an academic and a psychologist. You know, psychology is a social science, but it's nonetheless based on pretty rigorous standards of measurement and assessment. Right? It's a real science. And not nearly in the same way that I think physics is the hard science or the mathematics, but nonetheless it's rigorous. So in psychology, contrary to what sometimes people think, it's not like, oh, whatever you think is happening, right? It's not the case. I mean, I think there's a solid perspective. We certainly know beyond a shadow of a doubt what are the elements that are needed for children to grow up to be safe, secure, healthy, and smart. And we're not doing many of those things in our society, so we're having lots of children who struggle. But the reason for me, I think I have somewhat of an easy time integrating spirituality with psychology is essentially my view of creation is that the sciences are part of the unfolding way we come to know the nature of this created world. One of my favorite figures in the history of science, but also in the field of theology, is a French Jesuit priest who was a paleontologist named Teilhard de Chardin. And de Chardin talked often about the evidence in paleontology surrounding evolution. He thought evolution certainly was not a concept that was contrary to creation of man. Right? He believed evolution, and he regarded, in fact, Christ as the omega point, the high point of evolution. And I learned about some of Chardin in high school back then. And Chardin would say, nothing below is profane for those who know how to see it. And that's how I view science. Science is for me, part of my interest and effort to really come to understand the nature of who we are and how we become who we become. And all along the way, that message, that knowledge that I think I can discern or derive is never contrary to what I think of us in terms of created human beings in the image of God. So I've been lucky enough to find a way in my own thinking to never see the conflict. If anything, I think, and my brother and I, Gabe and I, were talking about this recently, that, and I think in one of our earlier conversations I said this, but it applies here. The nature of who we are as humans, our unique neurobiology, our unique sensory systems, our unique histories, our unique experiences, all sort of blend to sort of help us become who we are. But on top of that, on top of our nature, the nature of who we are, grace builds. And so the things we regard as the spiritual world, the world of prayer, the world of relationships with a deity, with our God, all build on the nature of who we are. And similarly, when things are happening in our world that seem so contrary to our nature and contrary to our goodness and humanity, I think sometimes there is such a thing as evil that builds on our nature. I have to say, in the field of psychology, it's unpopular to talk about evil because it's regarded more as the field of metaphysics and the field of religion, not science. And yet, in my integrated view of who we are as human beings, I've found a way to make a living in my career and to write and publish and work in the field in such a way that I felt so fortunate to be working on deepening my understanding of the nature of who we are, and that includes for me a spiritual view. Chardin had this wonderful saying. He says, we are not human beings on a spiritual journey, we are spiritual beings on a human journey. And that for me is how I've tried to integrate those fields. So I've been very fortunate in my life to see things that way, I think anyway.
One of the things that you said very beautifully about the science and stuff, I was reminded of a quote by Galileo that God wrote the universe in the language of mathematics.
I think love
that's
that.
A Galileo quote. And as far as evil goes, that's an interesting concept. I think Aquinas would define it as the absence of good. But that's Aquinas. I'm not going to.
You're not going to question that, Summa.
But
right.
The aspect of, and this is obviously in the spiritual realm, can evil be personified? And those are other questions. And the Catholic Church says yes, and I think other churches say yes as well. And of course, that can be over-commercialized.
Yeah.
The exorcism and all of that. Do I think it happens? I do. And I think exorcisms are valid, but I also think that the wisdom of the church really shows. If you read the rite of exorcism and the general instructions, the church says you must eliminate every other possibility.
That's right.
And even though every priest has the power of exorcism, it has to be actualized by the bishop after a very thorough examination by priests, psychologists, doctors, everyone. And then only then it's granted. I believe, I'm not sure of this, but I think it's true, every diocese has an exorcist.
Right,
but
I
they
remember
keep
that,
his identity.
His identity
pretty much,
under wraps, right? Yeah.
And as I understand, I'm certainly not an expert in this, but as I understand, it is a very, very difficult process, and it takes a lot out of the individual exorcist. How the hell did we get on that? No,
I don't know. I know.
Sorry. Anyway. This should be a comedy. Mom always liked you.
That's
better,
right. Mommy's, that's right. Smother's Brothers.
Smother's
Brothers, right.
Mom always liked you.
So one of the reasons why I'm so happy to have a chance to create this oral record of my life and Uncle Gabe's life, or Gabe's life, but mostly for my children, Uncle Gabe, is to just sort of give you some story about where you came from. Who are the people in your past, especially for those who come after we pass? Well,
this is primarily geared towards Ryan, Kerry, and Phil. I don't know when you'll see this, but my hope for you wherever you are and whenever you see this, is that you always take the basics. So if you're in mathematics, it's 1, 2, 3, and writing, it's ABC. Music, it's the scales, and whatever it might be. Vince Lombardi said the basics in football are blocking and tackling. And what I wish for you is that you always embrace the 3 basics that St. Paul talked about. That's faith, hope, and love. I pray that you're people of faith, and that faith is always there for you. Hope is like almost a faith for the future. It's casting your cares on the Lord and realizing that you're not alone. And kind of faith goes from the past. We believe what we've heard from our priests, our parents, and hope is the virtue of the future, because that's what's going to happen. Well, when the past and the future converge, it's to the present, and that's the most important thing. The most important virtue is love. And so I wish you faith, I wish you hope, and most of all, I wish you love.